I hope people liked the way that I did chapter 1. I'm going to do chapter 2 now of Sansûkh. Before we move on, I just want to kind of go over some of the really often used Khuzdul words, or Khuzdul, or however you say it. I'm going to say Khuzdul. I put the translations in the description of the last chapter, and I'll put them in every chapter for any words that are used that aren't English. But I thought I'd go over just a reminder of what the most often used ones are. So we've got Inudoi, which means son. We've got Adad, which means father or dad, and Amad, which means mother or mum. We've got Nidoyith and Nidoyel, which Nidoyith is boys, and Nidoyel is, or I can't remember which one, but they both basically means boy. Nidoi is boy, so any derivation of Nidoi is related to boys. The Undayu or Undayu is nephews or nephew. I'm just trying to think of other ones that are really obviously used a lot. I can't think of any more, but obviously as they come up, I will put the translations in the descriptions. Without further ado, I'll stop rambling. Chapter 2. He was wrapped in a soft, shapeless robe. I'm sorry. I feel like I don't want to cut this out because it's like funny bloopers. I can read, I promise. Start again. He was wrapped in a soft, shapeless robe and led to a smaller room. He could tell it was smaller from the sweet, tinkling echoes. It smelled like good, deep rock. There was a bed. He slept like the dead. When he woke, his mother was there. He could barely make out her face through blurred vision, but her smile shone through his blindness and was just as glorious as it had ever been. Her soft, wheat gold hair still curled around her face, and her eyes were still exactly the same shape and colour as his own. He was glad. He had wondered if old, long-nursed grief had warped his memories. Fries helped him dress and took his hand before leading him out into a great buttressed hall and a dizzying array of dwarves and heat and noise and laughter. It took some getting used to. Dwarro's centuries dead greeted him, and as his sight returned, he occasionally found himself brought up short by a familiar face or a vague family resemblance. Surely that was a Durin nose. Surely those were the family ears. He walked around in a haze of recognition and bewilderment. Thorin's grandmother, Queen Hrera, fussed and tutted over him more than she had ever had as a young dwarfling. It took all his patience to refrain from reminding her that he was in fact older than her now, and had more white in his hair and beard than she had ever managed. Not that she would have listened anyhow. The women of his family had always been even more mullish than the men. Fili and Kili smirked a lot whenever she managed to corral him and tweak his cheek. He had his revenge when Hrera descended on them in turn and promptly began to plait Kili's hair. A dwarf with a multitude of honey-coloured braids and a puckish, mischievous face came nearer, and Thorin's mouth opened on a soft intake of breath. Then he grabbed the dwarf's shoulders and drew him into a rough embrace. Vili. His brother-in-law silently pressed their foreheads together. "Thank you for raising them," said Vili, son of Var. "Thank you for being there when I could not." Thorin fumbled for Vili's hand and grasped it tightly. "They are the best of my life," he said, and Vili's eyebrows rose, and the ghost of an impish grin that had captured Dis's heart passed over his lips. "Then maybe we should go and rescue them from Hrera." Thorin looked back at the grouching Fili and the moaning Kili. "No, it's good for them." Vili chuckled and folded his arms, watching his sons complain and grouse. His eyes were fond, and his smile grew until it was the spitting image of the grin that Kili had inherited. So it is. His grandfather's dear friend, the stoic and dependable Gnar, who had braved Moria for love of Thror, clasped Thorin's wrists and told him that he was a dwarf amongst dwarves, a hero of their people. His old great-uncle Gror, First Lord of the Iron Hills, slapped at his back and told him, "Well done." His great-grandfather, Dane the First, slain by a cold drake before Thorin's birth, grinned at him from ear to ear, and pumped his hand until his fingers went numb. His cousins, Nain and Fundin, both burned dwarves of Azanulbizar, instantly crowded him with enthusiastic pleas for news of their sons. I'm just going to pause it there so we can all get on the same page here. I'm sure everyone watching this has already read Sansûkh, but Nain is the father of Dain, Thorin's cousin. Technically, I think he's his second cousin, because Nain and Thrain are cousins. And then Fundin is the father of Balin and Dwalin, and he is also the cousin of Nain and Thrain. And Fundin's brother is Groin, who is the father of Oin and Gloin, who he is the grandfather of Gimli. Okay, this will all be gone over, but I just thought I would get that out there. Sorry, got an itchy nose. Get that out there so that everyone's on the same page. Though Mahal had mentioned that any dwarf in the halls could watch over their kin at any time, it appeared that the immediacy of his tales was greatly appreciated and sought after. Though it tore at his heart, Thorin told them all that he could remember. His old cousin Farin, father to Fundin and Groin, was quiet and calm, a smile tugging at his lips as he listened to the stories of his 4 heroic grandsons of the company, Balin, Dwalin, Oin and Gloin. Groin was the worst of the lot, however. He was so proud of his grandson he was likely to explode, and asked Fili and Kili for any tales of their young playfellow at any and every opportunity. At these times, Thorin would take the opportunity to slip away and explore. The halls of Mahal were of sweet ringing rock, and the busy sounds of pickaxes and hammers tapped away at all hours. Though thousands upon thousands of dwarfs swarmed the halls, none seemed crowded, and each had room enough for their needs. It was all a mystery to Thorin. Where were the halls located? Aman, yes, obviously, but where? Were these great mines and workshops located in the halls of Mandos, the doomsman of the Valar? Or did the dwarves bide their long years of waiting within the mountains of Mahal, their maker? And for that matter, whence came the food for the wood for the forges? Where the cloth for the clothes? Where the food for the meals? No dwarf could tell him, and most seemed grudgingly resigned to never knowing. Thorin's temperament was not well suited to such mysteries, and he began to eye each meal suspiciously until his mother told him to stop it and eat. As his strength and sight returned, great and wondrous things were revealed to him. There were graceful corridors of twisting stone, carved into such intricate delicacy that they seemed made of snow or feathers, and yet they were harder than dragon scale and older than the foundations of Khazad-dûm. His father showed him vast, vaulted halls, their ceilings covered in curling golden patterns, and with pillars of purest white marble carved into ancient designs. Vili, Fili, and Kili dragged him through crystal caves that shattered the darkness into dancing prisms of light at the merest flicker of a lamp. His grandmother showed him a cave where water dripped in a musical cascade like hundreds of tiny silver bells chiming at once. His mother took him to deep and velvet dark mines that yielded the greenest emeralds he had ever seen, and mithril like the pure bright soul of the earth held in his cupped hand. His brother dragged him through workshop after workshop, and Thorin had almost lost his composure at the cunningly wrought works of beauty and skill that flourished under the hands of the greatest of their race. Narvi of Khazad-dûm worked beside Bar of Belagost and Telchar of Nogrod, and marvels blossomed beneath their hammers and chisels. Frerin laughed openly at his astonishment, before dragging him onwards to gape at yet another wonder. Finally, his brother slowed before a great arched door wound about with pearls, diamonds, and mithril, and his shoulders stiffened as though he was about to plunge himself through fire. He took Thorin's hand and led him through into a round stone chamber. The walls were curtained in limestone formations, white, alien shapes that reminded him of the drape of fabric or even of soft white wings, fluted and graceful. The roof was covered in white stalactites that dripped like melted candle wax towards a great mirrored underground lake. Dwarves were seated around it on carved stone benches, gazing deeply into the water. Some were smiling gently, whilst others wept into their beards. "This is the chamber of Sansûkh," Frerin said softly. "This is Gimlîn-zâram, the pool filled with starlight from no earthly sky. Here we may watch our loved ones left behind in Arda." Thorin gave his brother a quick glance. Freren's normally merry face was solemn, his bright blue eyes dark. He noticed Thorin's regard, and the corner of his mouth twitched ruefully. "I spent a lot of time here," he said, "sitting upon that bench. That one just over there. I watched you and Dis and Dwalin and Balin, watched you all go older and harder and colder." He swallowed hard and tugged absently at his forked beard. "Mother and I nearly broke when you finally smiled again after Fili's birth. We'd almost forgotten what it looked like." Thorin did not speak, but he clasped his brother's shoulders in wordless support. "Did you want to see?" Mahal's promise leapt to mind, and Thorin hesitated. The strange warmth that had suffused him still burned in his chest, as though made of banked embers, and he touched the place over his heart with tentative fingertips. The sleeping mind, the subconscious. But how? How was he to reach his people across the sundering seas and from the halls of the dead? Frerin quickly added, "You don't have to. Look, no one's forcing you to." "I will look," Thorin said heavily, the words feeling as though they were being pulled from him with pliers. His feet were leaden as he stepped to one of the benches and sat. The water was a dark glass sheet before him. It did not reflect light, nor the stalactites above them, and no stars beckoned in its depths. "What do I?" he began, but Frerin hushed him and took his hand. "Just watch," he said softly. Thorin frowned, glaring at the water. I'm sorry, that's so Thorin to glare at water. It's like, it's water, Thorin. Like, calm down. Okay. Thorin frowned, glaring at the water. Nothing was happening. This was foolishness. Perhaps it was one of Frerin's pranks. A pinprick of light began to pulse in the black depths of the pool, and he gasped. The light was joined by another and yet another, growing in radiance until finally a galaxy of bright stars winked and whirled beneath the silvery surface of the water. "You see it then?" Frerin murmured. "I think so," Thorin said in awe as the stars blazed forth. "It's beautiful." "It is," was the soft reply. The stars grew too bright to look at directly, and he squinted as he tried to make out the pool against the glare. Abruptly, the light was gone, and Thorin was left blinking in the aftermath. A familiar dwarf was sitting before him, his head cradled in his hand. "Dwalin!" Thorin cried in shock, and started forward to his oldest friend and cousin, but his arm passed straight through the body of the loyal warrior. The hand in his clamped down like an iron shackle. "They cannot hear you," Frerin said, tugging him back. "They cannot feel you. They yet live, and we are but a dream of who we were." "But he cannot hear you," Frerin repeated. "Our cousin is as much a ghost to us as we are to him." "No," Thorin growled. "I was promised. Mahal gave me a gift. I can reach them." Frerin shook his head. "We all think so at first." Thorin turned back to Dwalin, who was smoothing his hands over his tattooed pate. His nose was reddened as though he had been weeping, and one of his eyes was packed tightly with cloths, while a bandage was wound tightly around his ribs. "I did not know he was injured," Thorin said. Frerin snorted. "Would Dwalin ever say?" "You bloody fool." Dwalin sighed and scrubbed at his face before standing awkwardly and making his way with careful steps to a shelf. There, he pulled down a flask, tore out the cork with his teeth, and took a long swig. "Somehow, I don't think that will help, brother," came another familiar voice. Thorin whirled round to see Balin in the doorway, his white hair covered by a filthy bandage, and part of his magnificent beard cut close to reveal a nasty, jagged cut along his cheek and jaw. "And I'm fairly certain it wasn't in Oin's orders." "He's got his medicines, I've got mine," Dwalin growled, and took another sip. Balin heaved a sigh, before limping over to the bed and sitting upon it with a pained grunt. Thorin stepped back out of his way and only then realised where they were. Erebor. "We're in Fundin's old quarters," he murmured. "They must have become the Restoration," Frerin said, equally hushed. Dwalin sat down beside his brother and handed him the flask. "Your beard looks ridiculous," he said, and Balin hummed as he took a dram. "Aye, Azaghâl belkul, and you move like an old gaffer of 300. Better than some." "True, Nori won't be so stealthy in the future, I fear, not with that steel peg for a foot." "That'll stop his thieving," Dwalin grunted and snagged the flask back. "Nori lost a foot," Thorin said in blank horror. Sly, vain, clever Nori had lost a foot. Dwalin and Balin were injured. How had the rest of his company fared? Balin held his fingers over the mouth of the flask to stop his brother from drinking, and Dwalin glowered at him with one good eye. "You've been hiding yourself in here, Nadadith," Balin said gently. "The others wonder and worry about you." "I'm fine," Dwalin snapped. "Tell them not to waste their time." "You're not," Balin said. "You're mourning. It is natural, brother." Dwalin snarled, and his fists bunched. "Nothing is natural now that they are dead." Balin shook his head. "That isn't what I meant. It isn't right that they are gone, but it is right that you miss them. I miss them too. So do the others. They wish to share their grief with yours so that we can heal around our great wound together." "You didn't know him like we did," Dwalin said, his face mottled and angry. His lips tightened and his throat bobbed rapidly. "They did not grow up with him, did not share all his hardships." "Maybe the others were not as close as us," Balin said, and with a gentle hand brought his brother's forehead against his own. "But they shared their lives in others' way. Dori brought up his brothers in the poverty of Ered Luin, just as he did for Fili and Kili. Ori used to trail after the lads like a lost pet. Bofa and Bomba lost Bifa's words to orcs just as he lost Thror. Gloin was in the same training group as Dis, and the pair of them would terrorize Dane every time he visited. Don't you remember?" Dwalin was still for a moment, and then his head bowed. Balin smoothed his hand over Dwalin's patterned head. "We travelled with them, shared their meals, their songs, their dangers. We all braved trolls and orcs and wargs and goblins and spiders, even barrels, together. The others have a right to their sorrow, and they wish to comfort you in yours. He did not belong to we two alone. He belonged to all of us. He was our king." "Aye, our king," Dwalin said bitterly, and his eyes closed so tightly that deep furrows were carved into his skin. "Our friend and our king." "Shazara, Dwalin, or I'll finally take your head, you old sot," Thorin managed through numbed lips. Freyrin pulled him close, and Thorin buried his face against the warm, living shoulder, breathing harshly. "Are you all right?" he murmured. "Aye," he rasped. "I did not think they would mourn." Freyrin seemed surprised. "Why would they not?" Thorin raised his head and glared, and Freyrin sighed. "Gold madness or no, Thorin, you were their friend. You were their king for a century, ever since father disappeared. They loved you. Of course they mourn." Thorin buried his head again, and Freyrin tugged on his braid comfortingly. "Come on, close your eyes. There are others to see." Thorin closed his eyes, and when next they opened he was looking out at a hall covered in a sea of sluggish bodies. The hundreds upon hundreds of wounded were filling the air with their groans and cries, and Thorin bit down on a cry of his own as he saw the carnage the orcs had wrought. Oin looked exhausted. His curled braids were frayed, and his eyes were deep black pits in his sunken face. Gloin, Dori, and Bilbo moved around him with mechanical movements, washing the wounded, feeding them, boiling water, and smearing ointment on injuries. In a corner, in a great rotted chair, sat Nori, tearing cloth to make bandages. His left leg came to a shocking stop below his knee, and a metal peg, obviously Bofa's work, sat half-finished beside him. Amongst the beds trudged Oin, drooping and ceaseless, his hands never still as he stitched and cut and wrapped. None of them spoke. Oh, just a quick pause because, it's so sad. I feel so much for the members of the company left kind of like adrift and just unable to carry on, but they have to. They can't stop, and that's just... Okay, carrying on. The sight of the hobbit, his eyes haunted, caused a great surge of regret in Thorin's breast. Bilbo drifted through his tasks as though he were the ghost and not Thorin. His curly head was wrapped in a cloth. Every now and then Gloin would rest a comforting hand on his thin little shoulder. The memory of the contented proper little fellow, bobbing on the mat he had met in the Shire all those months ago, suddenly struck him, and he tore his eyes away. He could not ever forgive himself for what he had done, though Bilbo could forgive him 1,000 times over. Gloin paused over a pallet, and Thorin dimly recognised the unmistakable shape of Bomba. The large, friendly dwarf was wrapped in bandages from the thigh downwards, and in his sleep his face was screwed up in pain. Gloin chewed on his lower lip for a moment before signalling Dori. The silver-haired dwarf nodded and came to hold down Bomber's shoulders with his powerful hands. They met each other's eyes, and then Glóin cut away the bandages. Bomber's eyes flew open and he screamed. Underneath the cloths, a black putrescence was creeping up Bomber's leg. With a sickening swoop in his belly, Thorin recognised orc poison. Glóin uncorked a bottle and began to massage the stuff into Bomber's leg, ignoring his shrieks of pain. Oozing pus came gushing from the wound, streaked with black, and Glóin sighed. "Need to open it again, do you think?" he said dully. Dori's face sagged, though his voice was brisk. "Yes, indeed we will, Mr. Glóin. This time, however, I'll do it. Your sewing is atrocious, if you'll pardon me saying." "I'm a banker, not a weaver," Glóin retorted. Bomber mercifully passed out. Thorin clamped his teeth together until they creaked, and his eyes flew to Bilbo. He was carefully spooning soup into the mouth of Ori, who was hunched over as his breath wheezed and rattled. It appeared that there was blood in his lungs, and from the look of the poultice against his face, he had narrowly missed losing his nose. Lying on the pallet beside Ori was Bifur. He lay insensate, his body twitching every now and then. The axe head he had carried for decades had been torn from his skull, and his head was packed in bloody rags. Occasionally Oin would examine a wounded dwarf only to turn away with a wooden expression. That dwarf would be made comfortable, given potions to make their sleep as painless as possible, and left alone to drift out of the world. Through his shame, Thorin wondered how many new residents of the halls there were that he was responsible for. Frerin put his hand on Thorin's upper arm. "Come on." With a final look at the hobbit, Thorin closed his eyes. When next they opened, he was looking out into the honeycombed and vaulted audience hall of Erebor, with its towering paths of stone, and his cousin was slumped on the throne, glowering. His wild red hair was scraped back in a queue rather than in his customary flowing braids, and above him yawned the hole where the Arkenstone once shone. Dane seemed to have aged a century since Thorin had last looked upon him. His hand moved restlessly, as though grasping for his great red battle-axe, Barad-dûr, as he listened to the elven princeling speak. "We will help," the prince was saying. "My father has agreed. We shall send food and medicines to Bard, and he can send them to you. I doubt your people will trust them should we bring them directly." "That's a change of tune," remarked a voice, and to Thorin's great astonishment, Bofur was hunched beside the throne, his arms folded and the pitiful remains of his hat crammed on his head. His normally cheerful face was pulled down into lines of suffering, and the light in his eyes was cynical and cold. "Thought you didn't believe in helping us." The prince gave Bofur one of those ageless, inscrutable elven stares. "A friend made me see it clearly," he eventually said. "This is our fight." "A convenient time for you to finally see sense, now that the dragon's dead and everything lies in ashes," Dane growled. The prince inclined his head regretfully. "We will help," he repeated. "Elves," said Frerin sourly. "Always too late or too early." Bofur seemed to agree wholeheartedly. He pulled his tunic straight with a sharp jerk and a contemptuous snarl and stalked away. Dane watched him go with weariness written all over his face, before turning back to the elf. "Forgive him, Prince Legolas," he said. "He suffered at the hands of your hospitality, shall we call it? And later, of course, it seemed that men and elves alike would happily clamber over their corpses in order to steal that which rightfully belongs to our people. Dwarves do not quickly forget an injustice." "I hope dwarves will also remember that we fought for them in the end," said Legolas quietly. "Aye, possibly. Dane sighed loudly and pulled a sheet of parchment closer. "Don't hold your breath, though, laddie." Legolas's mouth tilted upwards the very smallest amount. "Is Dane signing a treaty?" Thorin spluttered in outrage. "He is! Dane, stop that! Cast this traitor elf out of my mountain, throw him from the highest peak." Frerin rolled his eyes. "I wouldn't speak of throwing anyone from anywhere if I were you." "Bilbo." The guilt suffused him once more, and Thorin's mouth snapped shut. "That was cruel," he hissed. "So were you," Frerin pointed out. "Dane will do what he must. The Elven King is powerful, and Mirkwood stands between Erebor and the southern kingdoms of men. Erebor needs his goodwill for trade, if nothing else. At least this son of his doesn't seem so bad." "This son of his threatened to kill me." "And you handled the situation with such tact and diplomacy, I'm sure. Dane knows that Erebor is just the watchtower of the north. It guards all free peoples, not just the Dale folk and dwarves." But Dale is a ruin, and maybe one for some time, Frerin interrupted. In the meantime, food must come from somewhere, and the elves have it, and the men do not. Open your eyes, Nadad. He is right. You may not like it, but Dane is better at this than you. He has ruled the Iron Hills ever since Azaghâl, 140 years of peace and prosperity. He's a proven leader and politician, and he knows this stuff inside out, better than you or I, wanderers that we were. I'm just going to pause for a second, because I love Frerin so much. I know I've said this before, but I love him. I love Frerin. I'm so glad we get to see him in this. Yes. Oh. Okay, sorry. That's it. Carrying on. How do you know this? Thorin said, rounding on his brother. You hated lessons. Frerin shook his head in exasperation. Because I have watched for decades upon decades. How do you think? Thorin grunted and turned back to Dane. The grizzled old warrior nodded to the prince, who bowed in response. Then the elf left, his robes flowing out behind him as upon silent feet he walked down the long and broken stone walkways. Dane rubbed at his forehead before standing and making his way past the throne to the door set behind its base, opening it and stepping into the king's antechamber. There he paused and leaned heavily upon a table, and only then did Thorin notice the bandage wrapped around his leg. Blood was seeping through it. He is wounded, he said. Frerin raised his eyebrows. You know, Dane, wouldn't show a weakness if his life depended on it. That Dwarrow is iron all the way through. Stubborn idiot, Thorin said as Dane massaged the edges of the wound with his huge fingers. It's a proud family trait, Frerin grinned. You stubborn idiot, Dane suddenly said, and laughed aloud in his gruff voice. Thorin blinked. Did he just... Would have had my head for this, wouldn't you, cousin? Dane continued, his eyes fixed on some distant memory. Thorin followed his gaze to where the crown sat on its bed of rotted silk. Thrown me from the peak of the mountain, no doubt. Well, I dearly hope there's no elves where you've gone to, else you'd be even grimmer in death than you were in life. Instead, you trap me in this damned stinking place and leave me to deal with this mess. Me, dealing with them bloody enigmatic weed-eaters and those pompous grasping men. And don't get me started on wizards. If you were here before me, Thorin, you stiff-necked bastard, I'd cut you down myself, so I would. Jorin's hammer and tongs, Frerin whispered. Do you think he can? I told you, Thorin said thickly. Mahal gave me a gift. They will sense my words in their deepest minds. Frerin stared at him. I know. Thorin closed his eyes. I am unworthy. Not that, Frerin said. You must watch what you say. This is a power no dwarf should have. Thorin frowned. Why? They cannot hear my words as you do. You could influence them without their knowing, Frerin said, his bright, youthful face unusually serious. You must be careful, Thorin. They could act without knowledge of their actions. Opening his mouth to retort, Thorin abruptly called the subtle power of the gold and his desperate determination to see the treasures of his people safe in dwarven hands. Troubled, he turned back to Dane. Aye. But Dane was gone. In his place lay a weeping Dwarrodam, her head thrown across her crossed forearms, and her dark hair, streaked with silver, splayed about her shoulders. The room about her was neat and modest, nothing like the ruined grandeur of Erebor. This was Ered Luin. Oh, said Thorin faintly. She did this after Azaghâl as well, Frerin said, his voice subdued. For months and months, you didn't see. You were travelling back from Moria with the dead and wounded. She stayed strong in the face of the court, and she guided our people in our grandfather's absence. But she wept in the silence of her rooms. The sole survivor of Thror's line sobbed into her sleeves, and in her cries of despair was a deep and echoing loneliness that shook Thorin to his core. Sister, he said miserably, the guilt and almost physical ache. Sister, please stop. It is all right. It will be all right. No, Frerin said sharply and pulled Thorin's face back to his. If she can hear you from deep within, tell her what she needs to hear. Tell her. His brother took a painful breath. Tell her as I wished I could. Thorin stared wretchedly at Frerin, his lost brother, here with him in this shared embrace of death. Then he looked over at Dís, their stubborn, steel-willed baby sister. Dís wrapped her arms around her body and let out a long, low moan. A message was crumpled in her hand. Her eyes, darkest brown like Thrain's and Keely's, were awash with tears that streaked down her cheeks to soak her intricate pattern-shaved beard, and her strong Durin nose was reddened from her crying. Dis, Thorin began helplessly, and then looked back at Frerin. Gather your courage, O king under the mountain, he said in a low voice. Thorin straightened his shoulders, and then hesitantly, tentatively sat beside his sister. He halted for a moment to gather his racing thoughts, and then he began to speak. Dis, he said gently, I love you. I'm sorry I left you. I'm sorry I took your boys away from you. The halls are a marvel, and we will wait for you. Vili is here, and he longs for you. Fili and Kili are here, and they miss you desperately. Oh, Dis, you should see them with Frerin. It is a catastrophe waiting to happen, just as you always said. Mother speaks of you often, you know, and father is here, and he is himself again. Grandfather and grandmother, Fundin and Groin and the rest, we're all here, and we love you. We will watch over you until it is your time to join us. We will wait for you, but you must also wait for us. He paused, and then he lifted his hand to hover it above her grey-streaked hair. Little sister, he murmured, I wish I hadn't left you all alone. It is one of my deepest regrets, and I have so many. Oh, so very many. I will not blame you if you hate me. Oh. Frerin watched silently as Thorin tried to stroke Dis's hair, and his hand passed directly through the long, tangled locks. Live on for us, Namadith, Thorin said, and his throat closed around the words, making them sound thin and reedy. Wait for us. Lead our people back to our home. Dis blinked back her tears, and her hand tightened around the crushed message. That prideful fool, she rasped, her voice harsh with weeping. Aye, Thorin said, and smiled through a fresh storm of shame. A prideful fool who loves you. Though I die, that will never change. No veil of death can stop it. Nothing ever stopped him, she said, and buried her face in her hands once more. Why did he never stop? Line of Durin, sister, he said, and swallowed roughly. A proud family trait. Damn the line of Durin to the nethermost pits of Moria, she hissed into her palms, and her voice began to rise with barely contained anguish. Damn our line, and damn our pride, and damn our name, and damn our blind, wilful madness. Let the dragon have Erebor if it would bring them back to me. I would have them here. How am I to go on alone? My sons are gone, my brother gone. Our line is spent, and I am alone. She whirled and took up a cup on her dresser and flung it against the wall with a cry of rage and misery. You will go on, said Thorin. You will, daughter of kings, best of sisters. You are as stubborn as the rest of us. She collapsed across her bed, and her tears began anew. Thorin stood and sighed. Months, you say, he said grimly. Months, said Frerin. Do you think I reached her? I think it might take a few more attempts, Frerin said wryly. Thorin sighed again and closed his eyes. When next he opened them, he was upon a parapet looking down over the gates of Ered Luin. He blinked tiredly, the hollow ache under his ribs throbbing as though it was a second heart. But who is there left? Who of our family have we not seen? Frerin inclined his head. Ah, of course, the least and littlest, and certainly one of the loudest. Who? Thorin turned. A burly young dwarf, not even 70, was stacking wood for the braziers that would warm the night watchman. His bright red hair was pulled back into workman's braids, his short beard thick on his cheeks and tied into 2 small braids that stuck out either side of his chin. His face was set and pale. Gloin's son, he said in surprise. Aye, said Frerin. Did you forget him? Once the quest was joined, I did not give anything else much thought, Thorin said, and moved closer towards the young dwarf. So this is Gloin's star. Never spent much time with the lad, though he knew Fili and Kili well. He is almost grown. He's but 62, even younger than Dane's boy, Frerin said, scratching at his beard. He wished to go with you, if you remember. He thinks himself quite ripe for an adventure, but his father forbade it. It was quite a scene. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Studying the youngster's face, Thorin saw traces of the Durin line in his straight brows and wide shoulders, and in the stubborn set of his ears. His nose, however, was not the sharp blade of the Longbeard clan, but the round snub of the Broadbeams, and he had the fiery hair and beard inherited from Gloin's Firebeard mother. He favours his father, he he mused. "Lad!" came a shout from below. Gimli wiped off his sweaty forehead and leant over the parapet to see where the captain stood leaning on his pike in the courtyard. "You finished with the wood?" "Nearly," Gimli called back. He had a man's voice, deep and rough and touched with the accent of Thaforabbad, like gloins and oins. Just going to pause there for a second. I will not be attempting accents in this. I'm going to do my Dane voice, which you've heard already because I was Dane in the podfic and I've got a voice for him, but I will not be doing Scottish accents for Gimli and Gloin and Oin and Dwalin and Balin because I would butcher them. So it's just going to be my English one. I'm going to try and do voices, but as you can tell, I can't do voices that well. Especially not men's, because I'm a woman. So yeah, there will be voices, but not accents. Carrying on. "What is there to do after I'm finished?" "Water for the ponies," the captain said. "The patrol will be back in a couple of hours." "Aye, and the water will be ready," Gimli said, and went back to stacking the wood. "Does he not yet know?" Thorin wondered. "Gimli?" Frerin raised his eyebrows. "He knows. Look at how pale he is, and the spots of colour on his cheeks." Thorin watched the young dwarf work for a moment longer, noting the mechanical movements and the dogged persistence that kept one foot stepping in front of the other. "The lad is mourning his playfellows, and seeks to exhaust himself with work rather than weep," he said. "I have wept long enough," Gimli muttered to himself. "Aye, and loudly too. Work is what is needed. Work will tire my mind and keep my thoughts quiet." "Thorin!" Frerin's eyes widened in astonishment. "He hears you!" "He hears me well, even more clearly than Dane or Dís," Thorin said slowly, and he tilted his head as he studied his youngest cousin further. Gimli laced his fingers and made the knuckles crack loudly, and then he hefted a sawn tree round to the block and unslung a wood axe from his belt. A strong boy, then. He must be quite a perceptive lad. Gloin does well to be proud of him. My father would do well to send for me. Gimli suddenly growled before hewing at the wood with a smooth and practised swing. Dwalin himself could not have bettered it. Thorin was taken aback at the young dwarf's proficiency. Between each stroke, Gimli kept up his angry mutterings. "My uncle will need my help. I would comfort my cousins. I should have been there. They were greater than I and more important. I should have defied my father. I would have protected them. I would have brought their lives with mine if need be. No lord of the Iron Hills should sit the throne of Erebor." "Lofty ambitions," Frerin said, and leaned against the parapet. "See that swing? He's a natural axeman and already a talented warrior. Dwalin trained him along with our nephews. It was rather entertaining to watch them. They are both equally as pig-headed as each other." "He's a dwarf. Of course he's pig-headed," said Thorin. "And he's a Durin as well. There's another strike against him. What else of his character?" Frerin shrugged. "He's honest, and kind when he wishes to be. His loyalty, once given, is diamond hard and mithril true. His faithfulness is absolute, and he never breaks his word. This one will be a fine dwarf lord. Still, he is but a child, and can be quick to anger, impulsive, and occasionally rather brash." "This child is 14 years older than you ever were," Thorin thought. Aloud he said, "So just like you then," and Frerin grinned, though it was somewhat dimmed by the suffering they had seen. "I was never so loud." "You were louder, believe me," Thorin said, and turned back to Gimli, who was chopping away with a will. "So, there is still a young one left. Not all our children are spent." "Not all," agreed Frerin. "Dane's son Thorin rules the Iron Hills as regent, and Gloin's star still shines." Gimli stacked the last of his wood, and then leaned heavily on his axe, as he lifted his ruddy head in the thin, late afternoon sunlight. "Ah, my friends," he said softly. "Gaubdûkhimâ gagin yâkùlib Mahal. I will miss you. May they never forget you." Thorin's eyebrows lowered, but before he could say more, he blinked and was whirled away. The pool lay sparkling before him, the stars winking and fading in the depths. Thorin's neck was stiff, and he straightened with a groan before touching his face with his fingertips. His cheeks were wet. Frerin stepped up beside him and pulled him up by the arm. "Are you all right?" Thorin gazed at him for a long moment, and the weight of all his mistakes was heavier than the mountain. "No," he said, and turned away. Frerin gently took his hand and led him from the pool. Thorin thought on all he had seen and bowed his head. Ruin and despair had been left in his wake, and his sister, cousins, and companions were left with the whole terrible, sorrowful mess. The only flicker of light in the darkness was a muttering young Dwarrow who chopped wood with a warrior's swing, who wore Durin's brow and a broad-beam nose and the bright red hair of the Firebeards. Well, that is chapter 2 finished. I love this fic so much. I feel like I shouldn't be calling it a fic. I feel like I should be calling it a story. Like, it's that good. It's a story. It's a book. It's not a fan fiction. It's surpassed that. The writing is just, magnificent. And I love Debs. Yeah, so any translations I will basically just take from Debs' page on AO3, and then I'll put them in the video descriptions when I put this on YouTube. But yeah, that was chapter 2. Let me know if it's all right that I'm like interrupting to give kind of a little commentary, like a comment. I can't just fully just read it out, and also sorry about the mistakes, but I kind of like leaving them in because it makes it more real. Like, I'm not a professional doing this. I'm just sitting in my grandparents' drawing room reading Sansûkh because I love it so much. But that was chapter 2. See you for chapter 3.